The courtroom smelled like old paper and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, unforgiving glow on the scuffed wooden benches and the high-backed chair where the judge sat. It was just past 10 in the morning, and the air already felt heavy. Not just from the Alabama humidity pressing against the courthouse windows, but from the quiet tension that always seemed to hang in this room when certain people walked through the doors. She stood near the front, just a few feet from the bench, clutching a manila folder to her chest like a shield. Her hands were steady, but her heart wasn't. She'd worn her best blouse, navy blue, crisp with small pearl buttons, and her hair was neatly braided, pulled back in a low bun. She wanted to look professional, respectful. She'd been told more than once that in places like this how you looked could matter as much as what you said, especially if you were a black woman. She wasn't there for anything serious. Not really. It was a traffic ticket, failure to appear for a minor speeding citation months ago. But it had snowballed, because that day her youngest had spiked a fever of 104 degrees, and she'd rushed him to the ER instead of driving across town to court. She'd called, left messages, even emailed the clerk's office with a doctor's note. But somewhere in the system it got lost or ignored. Now the court had issued a bench warrant. Her license was suspended, and if she didn't clear this up today, her nursing board might flag her file. She couldn't afford that. Not with rent due, not with 2 kids depending on her paycheck. She took a slow breath. She'd rehearsed what to say, calm, clear, honest. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just a chance to explain. The judge entered without fanfare. No gavel bang, no dramatic pause. Just the creak of the door and the rustle of his black robe as he settled into his seat. Judge Harold Whitmore was in his late 60s with thinning silver hair combed neatly to the side and wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose. He moved with the slow confidence of someone who'd never been questioned, never doubted, never held accountable. He'd been on the bench for over 20 years. Everyone in the county knew his name, and most knew to keep their heads down when they appeared before him. He scanned the docket, flipping pages with a bored flick of his wrist. When he got to her case, he barely looked up. "Next," he said, voice dry as chalk. She stepped forward. "Your Honor, my name is—" "Just state your name and the case number," he interrupted, still not looking at her. His pen tapped impatiently against the desk. She swallowed. "Yes, sir. My name is Maya Thompson, case number 24CV7831. He finally lifted his eyes. They swept over her, quick, dismissive, like he was checking off a box rather than seeing a person. Then something shifted in his expression. A tiny smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Oh," he said, drawing the word out. "You're the one who missed court because of an emergency." He made air quotes with his fingers, slow and mocking. She blinked. "Yes, Your Honor. My son was hospitalized that morning. I have the medical records." "Another emergency," he cut in, louder now, leaning back in his chair like he was settling in for a joke. "Must be hard keeping track of time when you're always running late." A few people in the gallery shifted. Someone coughed. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, glanced toward the ceiling like he was praying for patience. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice even. "I wasn't running late, sir. I was at the children's hospital. I tried to notify the court." "Tried?" He let out a short laugh. "Everyone tries, but rules are rules. You think the law bends because you've got a sick kid?" "No, Your Honor. But I hope the court might consider the circumstances." "Typical," he muttered under his breath, but not quietly enough. The word hung in the air like smoke. She froze. It wasn't the first time she'd heard that word used that way. Not in stores, not in job interviews, not even in school when she was younger. But here, in a courtroom, where fairness was supposed to be guaranteed, where justice was supposed to be blind, she looked around, half expecting someone to say something. The public defender assigned to traffic cases just stared at his shoes. The prosecutor flipped through papers like he hadn't heard a thing. Even the court reporter's fingers paused for a second on the stenotype machine, but then from the back row a soft voice whispered, "That ain't right." She didn't turn. She couldn't. All her energy was focused on not crying, not yelling, not walking out. She'd worked too hard to get here, through nursing school, through night shifts, through every door that had almost slammed in her face, to let pride ruin her chance at fixing this. "Your Honor," she said, voice firmer now, "I'm not asking for the rules to change. I'm asking for a chance to follow them properly. I brought the hospital records. I'm ready to pay the fine. I just need the warrant lifted so I can keep working. Judge Whitmore sighed like she was wasting his time. He picked up his gavel, tapped it once, not hard but sharp. Motion denied. Warrant stands. License remains suspended. Next case, her stomach dropped. But no buts, he snapped. Court doesn't run on excuses. She opened her mouth again, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. From the corner of the room near the jury box, a small red light blinked steadily on a tripod-mounted camera. A young woman in a plain gray hoodie sat beside it, watching the screen with wide eyes. She hadn't been there when the session started. No one had noticed her come in, but she'd been recording the whole thing, live. The judge hadn't seen her. He was already shuffling papers, calling the next name. But the damage was done, and it was being broadcast in real time to a group of legal observers and civil rights advocates who'd been quietly monitoring Jefferson County's municipal court for months. They'd heard rumors, complaints, whispers about Judge Whitmore's style. Now they had proof. Back in the gallery, an older black woman reached out and gently touched Maya's arm as she stepped back from the bench. "You held your head high, baby," she murmured. "That's more than he deserves." Maya nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the floor. She felt hollow. Not angry yet, just tired. Tired of having to prove her humanity in rooms like this. Tired of being treated like a problem instead of a person. Outside, the sun beat down on the courthouse steps. A protest had been planned for later that week, a peaceful gathering about police accountability, but no one expected what was about to unfold inside these walls to ignite something much bigger. As Maya gathered her things, she noticed the young woman with the camera packing up. Their eyes met for a second. The girl gave a small, solemn nod. Maya didn't know what it meant. She just knew she needed to get home to her kids. But as she walked out of the courtroom, shoulders straight despite everything, she had no idea that in less than an hour, her name would be trending across the country, that strangers would share her story, that lawyers, journalists, and federal agents would start digging into Judge Whitmore's past, and that before the courthouse clock struck noon, the man who'd mocked her would be let out in handcuffs, not for what he said to her, but for everything he'd hidden for years. For now, though, all she felt was the weight of injustice pressing down on her chest, and the quiet, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe this time, someone would finally listen. She stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the glare. The air smelled like cut grass and car exhaust. Normal. Ordinary. But nothing would be ordinary again. Not after today. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore called the next case, unaware that his world was already crumbling. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke in that same dry, condescending tone. "Next," but this time no one answered right away. The silence stretched, and for the first time in his career, Harold Whitmore felt something unfamiliar. Unease. It wouldn't be the last. Across town, in a small office above a bookstore, a phone began to ring. Then another, and another. Screens lit up with alerts. Emails poured in. A legal team that had been waiting for a break in their investigation suddenly had everything they needed, delivered not by a secret informant, but by a mother who just wanted to keep her job and care for her child. And all of it started with 2 words, spoken in a voice thick with contempt. Typical. 2 words that would echo far beyond those courtroom walls. 2 words that would unravel a legacy of power built on prejudice. 2 words that, in the end, would cost a judge not just his robe but his freedom. But none of that mattered to her right now. Right now, she just needed to pick up her son from school, hold him close, tell him everything was going to be okay, even if she wasn't sure it was, because that's what mothers do. Even when the system fails them. Even when the gavel falls unfairly, they keep going. And sometimes, without even meaning to, they change everything. The video hit the internet like a spark in dry grass. It started on a small community justice page, just a local group that recorded court sessions to keep an eye on fairness. They'd been doing it quietly for months, mostly unnoticed. But this clip? This one was different. Within 20 minutes of being posted, it had been shared over 5,000 times. By lunchtime, it was everywhere. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. Not just the words typical, but the tone, the smirk. The way the judge leaned back like he was enjoying himself while a woman stood there, trying to explain why she missed court because her child was sick. It wasn't just rude. It felt cruel, and it felt familiar. Comments poured in faster than anyone could read them. I've been treated like that in that same courtroom. My sister cried after her hearing with him. This happens every day, but no one ever records it. One woman wrote, "I kept my mouth shut because I was scared. I'm so glad she didn't have to." News stations picked it up by early afternoon. First the local ones, then regional, then national. A major cable network ran a short segment during their midday broadcast. Judge under fire after courtroom exchange goes viral. They played the clip, just 30 seconds, but it was enough. You didn't need more. The look on the woman's face said everything. Meanwhile, she was at home, making grilled cheese sandwiches for her kids, completely unaware. Her phone had been on silent all morning, part of her routine on court days so she wouldn't get distracted. It wasn't until her neighbor knocked on the door, wide-eyed and holding a tablet, that she realized what had happened. "Did you see this?" the neighbor asked, voice trembling. "It's you. Everyone's talking about you." She took the tablet, confused at first. Then she saw herself on screen, standing there in that navy blouse, voice calm, eyes steady, while the judge sneered. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't even known she was being recorded. "Oh no," she whispered. "Oh no, no, no." She wasn't ashamed of what she'd said. She was proud she'd stayed composed. But now the whole world had seen her in that moment of vulnerability. Her face, her pain, her dignity, all laid bare for strangers to dissect. Her phone buzzed once, then again, and again. Dozens of notifications lit up the screen. Missed calls, voicemails, texts from people she hadn't heard from in years. Even her old nursing instructor sent a message. "You did the right thing. Hold your head high," but fear crept in too. What if this made things worse? What if the judge retaliated? What if her job found out and decided she was too controversial? She'd worked so hard to build a quiet, stable life for her children. Now it felt like it was all spinning out of control. Still, as the afternoon wore on, something else began to happen. Not just outrage, but support. Real human support. A local church group started a fundraiser to help cover her legal fees even though she hadn't asked. A retired teacher offered to watch her kids for free while she dealt with the fallout. A lawyer from a civil rights organization called and said, "We want to help. No charge." She almost cried when she heard that. By 3 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, not angry, not shouting, just standing there with signs that read, "Respect in court and justice for all." They weren't there to attack anyone. They were there to say, "This isn't okay, and we see you." Inside the courthouse, things were tense. Court staff whispered in hallways. The clerk who'd ignored her emails looked pale and kept avoiding eye contact. Even the bailiff, the one who'd stayed silent during the hearing, was seen talking quietly with a reporter near the parking lot. But the biggest shock came from an unexpected place. A woman who worked in the records office, someone who'd been there for 15 years, walked into the office of the State Judicial Conduct Board and dropped a thick manila envelope on the receptionist's desk. "I can't stay quiet anymore," she said. Then she left without giving her name. Inside the envelope were copies of old audio logs, internal memos, and handwritten notes. Evidence that this wasn't the first time Judge Whitmore had spoken to litigants like that. There were complaints from years ago, buried in files marked unfounded. Emails where he joked about those people not understanding the law. Notes from closed-door meetings where he'd argued against hiring more diverse court staff. The conduct board had received complaints before, but they'd always been vague. He was rude. He seemed biased, hard to prove. But now, with the video as a starting point, those old files took on new meaning. Patterns emerged. A trail of disrespect that stretched back over a decade, and then came the whistleblower. Not the records clerk, though she'd helped, but someone even closer. A former law clerk who'd worked directly for Judge Whitmore 5 years earlier. He'd stayed silent out of fear, worried it would ruin his own career. But after seeing the video, he couldn't take it anymore. He reached out to a federal investigator he knew through a legal ethics group. "There's more," he said. Much more. He described how the judge would sometimes alter docket entries after the fact, changing outcomes to favor certain defendants, usually those who'd donated to local events he supported. How he'd pressured witnesses in small claims cases to drop their suits if they were suing people he knew. How he once told a young black man, "You'll be back in here before the year's out," before the trial even started. None of it had been reported. No one thought anyone would believe them, but now with public attention focused on him, those stories had weight. By late afternoon, the state attorney general's office issued a statement. "We are reviewing the matter and will determine if further action is warranted." It was careful, legal language, but everyone knew what it meant. They were opening a file. Back at her house, she finally turned her phone back on fully. She listened to a voicemail from a national news network asking for an interview. She declined. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want this to be about fame. She wanted it to be about fairness. Instead, she called the civil rights lawyer who'd reached out earlier. "What can I do to help?" she asked. "Just tell the truth," the lawyer said. "That's all we need." That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with her kids doing homework. Her son asked, "Mom, why are people talking about you?" She thought for a moment. "Because I stood up for what's right," she said simply. Even when it was hard. He nodded like that made perfect sense. Later, after they were in bed, she scrolled through some of the comments online. Most were kind. Some were angry at the judge, not at her. But a few were ugly. "She's playing the race card. Why didn't she just show up to court?" She closed the app quickly. She wouldn't let those voices live in her head. Because the truth was, she hadn't set out to start a movement. She hadn't worn a hidden camera or planned a protest. She'd just shown up dressed neatly, spoke respectfully, and asked for a fair chance. And in doing so, she'd held up a mirror to a system that many had long suspected was broken, but no one had been able to prove. Now, people were listening, not just in Alabama. Across the country, other court watchers began reviewing their own recordings. Similar stories surfaced in Texas, Ohio, California. Judges making offhand remarks, rolling their eyes, cutting people off based on how they looked or where they came from. Her case became a rallying point. A hashtag, Fair Hearings Now, started trending. Legal scholars wrote op-eds. Law schools added her video to ethics discussions. Even some judges spoke out saying, "This is why we need accountability." And through it all, she stayed grounded. She went to work the next day, still in her scrubs, still checking vitals and comforting patients. Her coworkers hugged her in the hallway. Her supervisor pulled her aside and said, "If anyone gives you trouble about this, you come to me." She realized then that she wasn't alone. She never had been. There were thousands, maybe millions of people who'd been in her shoes, who'd swallowed their pride and walked out of courtrooms feeling small. But now, because one moment had been caught on camera, they felt seen. That night, she got a call from a woman in Georgia. Her voice was soft, shaky. "I went before that same judge 2 years ago," she said. "He told me I didn't belong in this neighborhood when I filed a noise complaint against my landlord. I cried in my car afterward. I thought it was just me. Thank you for showing me it wasn't." They talked for almost an hour. By the end, the woman promised to file a formal complaint with the judicial board. "If you can speak up," she said, "so can I." That was the real power of what had happened. It wasn't just about one judge or one courtroom. It was about breaking the silence, about showing people that their experiences mattered, and that change was possible. As the week went on, pressure mounted. The Judicial Conduct Board announced a formal investigation. The local bar association issued a statement calling for transparency. Even the mayor, who'd once praised Judge Whitmore at a charity gala, released a cautious note saying, "All citizens deserve dignity in our courts." And still, Judge Whitmore said nothing. No apology, no comment. He showed up for court the next day like nothing had happened, though the gallery was packed with reporters and observers. He avoided looking at the camera this time, but his usual swagger was gone. He seemed smaller. People noticed. By Friday, the story had shifted from outrage over a comment to pattern of misconduct. News outlets weren't just replaying the clip. They were digging into his past rulings, his campaign donations, his connections to local developers. Questions were being asked that no one had dared to ask before. And all of it, the protests, the investigations, the national conversation, had started with one woman standing in a courtroom, asking for a second chance. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, but also hopeful, because for the first time in a long time, It felt like the system might actually bend toward justice, not away from it. She tucked her kids in that night, kissed their foreheads, and whispered, "Everything's going to be okay." This time, she almost believed it herself. The courthouse was quiet that Monday morning. Too quiet. Usually by 9, the hallways buzzed with lawyers shuffling files, defendants whispering to family members, bailiffs calling out names. But today, people moved slower, spoke softer, glanced over their shoulders more than usual. Word had spread over the weekend. Something big was coming. No one knew exactly what, but everyone could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that comes right before a storm breaks. Inside courtroom 3, the same room where it all began, the wooden benches were nearly full. Reporters sat in the back, notepads ready, cameras discreetly tucked away. Recording was still technically forbidden without permission, but no one was enforcing it strictly anymore. A few regulars from the neighborhood were there too, the same folks who'd stood outside with signs last week. They didn't say much. They just sat, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the bench. Judge Whitmore arrived right at 9, as always. He wore his usual black robe, but his steps were heavier, his shoulders slightly hunched. He didn't greet anyone, didn't nod to the bailiff, just walked straight to his chair and sat down like he was bracing himself. He called the first case a simple parking violation, and got through it in under 2 minutes. His voice was flat, no trace of the smirk that used to curl at the edges when he felt in control. He moved quickly, almost nervously, like he wanted to get through the docket before something happened. But it was the second case that changed everything. Before he could even say the defendant's name, the courtroom doors opened, not with a bang, not with shouting, just a slow, steady creak. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, followed by a woman in a crisp navy blazer. They didn't rush. They didn't glare. They just walked calmly down the center aisle, their shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. Everyone turned to look. Even the judge paused, his pen hovering over the docket sheet. The lead man, a U.S. Marshal with silver at his temples and a calm, unreadable expression, stopped a few feet from the bench. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Judge Harold Whitmore," he said, clear and firm, "you are under arrest." A sharp intake of breath swept through the room. Someone dropped a folder. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The judge stared, blinking slowly as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me?" "You are under arrest," the marshal repeated, "for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and violation of federal civil rights statutes." This time the words landed like stones. Whitmore's face went pale. His hands, which had been resting on the desk, twitched. He looked around, not for help, but like a cornered animal scanning for an exit that wasn't there. I'm presiding over court," he stammered. "You can't—" "Federal warrant, Your Honor," the woman in the blazer said. She held up a sealed document, signed by a U.S. district judge this morning. "You're relieved of duty effective immediately." The bailiff, who'd worked under Whitmore for 12 years, stepped forward, but not to protect him. He moved to the side, giving the marshal's room. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Even his own staff had turned. Whitmore finally stood, gripping the edge of the bench for support. "This is a mistake," he said, voice cracking. "I've served this county for over 20 years. You can't just—" "We can," the marshal said gently. "And we are." He reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Not the thick, dramatic kind from movies, just standard-issue silver efficient. The sound of the click as they closed around the judge's wrists was quiet, but it echoed in the stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Whitmore looked down at his hands like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The same hands that had signed warrants, dismissed cases, mocked people from the bench, now bound by the very system he'd thought he controlled. "May I gather my things?" he asked, voice small. "You'll be processed at the federal building," the marshal replied. "Your personal effects will be returned to you." And just like that, they let him out. No gavel. No final ruling. No grand speech. Just the slow walk down the aisle, head bowed, robe still on, as the people he'd looked down on for years watched in silence. Some wanted to cheer. Others just felt numb. But most felt something deeper, relief. Like a weight they didn't even know they were carrying had finally been lifted. Outside, the sun was bright, the sky clear. A news van idled at the curb. When the doors opened and Whitmore stepped out, flanked by federal agents, cameras flashed instantly. He shielded his eyes not from the light but from the exposure. From the shame. Within minutes, the footage was live. Judge arrested in courtroom, the headlines read. Federal charges filed after viral video sparks investigation. But inside the courthouse, something else was happening. The clerk, the one who'd ignored the hospital records weeks ago, walked over to where she was sitting in the back row. She didn't say much, just handed her a sealed envelope. "I found this in the old file," she whispered. "It's the email you sent, with the doctor's note. It was never logged, never seen by the judge." She took the envelope, fingers trembling. She didn't open it right away. She just held it, feeling the weight of what it meant. Not just proof she'd tried, but proof the system had failed her on purpose. Later, in a quiet corner of the hallway, she finally opened it. There it was, her own words typed out in a late-night panic attached to a scanned note from the ER. Sent on time. Ignored without reason. She didn't cry, not then. But she tucked the paper into her bag like a promise. This wouldn't happen to someone else if she could help it. Back in the courtroom, the chief judge of the district had arrived to take over the docket. He was older, softer spoken, known for fairness. He didn't make a speech. He just looked out at the room and said, "Court will resume. Justice delayed is justice denied, and today we move forward." The first case he called, hers. She stood again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. This time the judge looked her in the eye, listened as she explained what happened, reviewed the hospital records, now officially entered into the file, and then without hesitation, he dismissed the warrant, lifted the license suspension, and apologized. "Not on behalf of the court," he said carefully, "but as a fellow human being. You deserved better." She nodded, throat tight. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she walked out, people stood. Not all of them, but enough, a quiet show of respect. No clapping, no fanfare. Just a room full of people acknowledging that something wrong had been made right, even if only in one small way. Meanwhile, downtown at the federal courthouse, Whitmore sat in a holding room, still in his robe, waiting for processing. His lawyer had been called. His wife was on her way, but none of that mattered now. The charges weren't just about what he'd said to her. They were about years of manipulating cases, pressuring witnesses, accepting gifts from local contractors in exchange for favorable rulings, and, most damning, altering court records to cover it up. The whistleblower's testimony had opened the floodgates. Bank records showed unexplained deposits. Text messages revealed backroom deals. And that video? It was the spark, but the fire had been burning for years. By noon, the U.S. Attorney's Office released a statement. "This arrest is the result of a months-long investigation into judicial misconduct. We do not take action against sitting judges lightly, but when trust in the judiciary is broken, the law must respond." The story exploded again, but this time it wasn't just about bias. It was about corruption, about power unchecked, about a man who thought the rules didn't apply to him. And through it all, she stayed out of the spotlight as much as she could. She gave one short interview. Not for fame, but to make sure people understood. This wasn't just about one rude comment. It was about a pattern, a culture, a system that let people like him stay in power for too long. "I didn't want him arrested," she told the reporter. "I just wanted to be heard. But if his actions finally catch up to him, maybe that helps someone else feel safe walking into a courtroom." That evening, she sat on her porch watching her kids chase fireflies in the yard. The air was warm, the sky turning pink at the edges. Her phone buzzed, a message from the civil rights group. "They're talking about reforming the whole municipal court system," it read. "Your case is the reason," she smiled faintly. She hadn't set out to change anything. She just wanted to keep her job. Keep her license. Keep her dignity. But sometimes doing the right thing, even quietly, creates ripples you never see coming. Inside the house, the TV was on low. A news anchor was saying, "This marks the first time in state history that a sitting judge has been arrested in open court." She turned it off. She didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew what mattered. Later that night, as she tucked her youngest into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes and asked, "Mom, are you famous now?" She laughed softly. "No, baby. I'm just your mom. But you stood up to the judge." "I did. and he got in trouble. He did. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Good." She kissed his forehead and turned off the light. In the quiet dark, she let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in weeks. The fight wasn't over. There would be hearings, appeals, debates about how to fix the courts. But today justice hadn't just been spoken about. It had been done, and that was enough. For now. The arrest didn't just shake the courthouse, it cracked something open in the whole county. People who'd stayed silent for years started talking, not in whispers this time, but out loud in public with names and dates and stories that had been buried under layers of fear and resignation. The State Judicial Conduct Board, which had once moved at a glacial pace, suddenly found itself flooded with complaints. Over 200 in just 3 days. Most came from people who'd stood before Judge Whitmore and left feeling smaller, ashamed or powerless. And now they weren't asking for apologies. They were demanding change. One woman came forward with a story from 2018. She'd been fighting her landlord for months over mold in her apartment that made her daughter sick. When she finally took him to court, Whitmore dismissed her case in under 5 minutes. "People like you always blame someone else," he'd told her. She'd walked out crying, convinced it was her fault for not knowing the right words. Now she sat across from investigators, voice steady, saying, "I wasn't wrong. He was." Another man, a small business owner, revealed how Whitmore had pressured him to drop a lawsuit against a city contractor who'd never paid for work done. He said, "You don't want to make enemies in this town," the man recalled. "I thought he was protecting me. Now I know he was protecting someone else." Dozens of similar accounts poured in, each one a thread in a larger, uglier tapestry. And the most heartbreaking part? Almost all the people who came forward were women. Black women. Poor women. Women who'd been told in 100 quiet ways that their voices didn't matter. That's when she knew she couldn't stay on the sidelines. She hadn't planned to testify. She'd hoped the video and the court records would be enough. But when the State Judicial Commission announced emergency hearings and asked if she'd speak, she said yes. Not for herself, but for the woman who'd been too scared to speak up in 2018. For the mother who'd lost her case and her home. For every person who'd walked out of that courtroom feeling like they didn't belong. The hearing room wasn't a courtroom, it was a conference hall in the state capitol, filled with folding chairs, microphones, and people who looked tired but determined. Cameras were allowed this time. No one tried to hide the truth anymore. When her turn came, she walked to the front slowly, hands clasped in front of her. She wore the same navy blouse she'd worn that day in court, not as a reminder of humiliation but as a symbol of resilience. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just spoke plainly, like she was telling a story to a friend. "I didn't go to court looking for a fight," she began. "I went because I needed to keep my license so I could keep working. My son was sick. I had proof. I followed the rules as best I could. But when I stood up there, I didn't feel like a citizen. I felt like a problem to be managed." She paused, looked around the room, at the commissioners, the reporters, the rows of people who'd come to listen. "This isn't just about one judge," she said. "It's about what happens when people in power decide who deserves fairness and who doesn't. It's about systems that make it easy to ignore voices like mine until someone records it and the whole world sees." She talked about the fear she'd felt walking out of that courtroom, the shame, the way she'd questioned herself for days. Was I too emotional? Did I say the wrong thing? Only to realize later it wasn't her. It was him. And it was the silence around him that let it continue. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then one by one, people began to stand. Not all of them, but enough. A quiet wave of respect that started in the back and moved forward like a tide. Afterward, a young woman approached her, eyes red from crying. "My mom went before him last year," she said softly. She didn't say anything because she was scared it would make things worse for her case. "But after seeing you, she filed a complaint today. That was the real victory, not the arrest, not the headlines, but the courage it gave others to speak." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, lawmakers were moving faster than anyone expected. The state legislature, which had ignored calls for judicial reform for years, now had a bill on the fast track. It proposed mandatory bias training for all judges, anonymous complaint systems for litigants, and most importantly, an independent oversight panel made up of lawyers. Community leaders and former court users, not just judges judging other judges, critics called it rushed, but supporters said, it's 20 years late. The governor, who'd once praised Whitmore at a fundraiser, now stood at a podium saying, trust in our courts is sacred. When that trust is broken, we must rebuild it, not with promises but with action. Even the local bar association, long seen as protective of its own, issued new ethics guidelines. Judges are not above the law, their statement read. They are its guardians and must be held to the highest standard. But the most powerful change came from the people. Community groups started Know Your Rights workshops outside courthouses. Volunteers handed out pamphlets in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese explaining how to file a complaint, how to request a court recorder, how to ask for a continuance without fear. A retired school teacher began offering free legal literacy classes at the public library. You don't need a law degree to know when you're being treated unfairly, she told her first class. And slowly, the culture began to shift. In other courtrooms across the state, judges started pausing before speaking. They made eye contact. They listened, not because they were afraid of cameras, but because they finally understood that fairness isn't a favor. It's a duty. Back home, she kept working her nursing shifts, kept packing school lunches, kept tucking her kids in at night. But now, when she walked into a room, people looked at her differently, not with pity but with quiet admiration. Not because she was special, but because she'd done what so many had wanted to do, stand tall when it would have been easier to shrink. One afternoon, she got a call from the state commission. They wanted her to serve on the new judicial oversight panel. She hesitated. I'm not a lawyer, she said. You don't need to be, they replied. We need people who've lived it. She said yes. Her first meeting was held in a sunlit room with a long wooden table. Around it sat lawyers, retired judges, professors, and her. At first, she felt out of place. But then the discussion turned to how court notices are written, full of legal jargon that confuses people who've never been through the system. She spoke up. Most people I know get scared just opening those letters, she said. They think it's already over before they even walk in. The room fell silent. Then a judge nodded slowly. You're right. We've been writing for ourselves, not for the public. That moment, small, simple, was everything. Not punishment, not revenge, but understanding. Real human change. As the weeks passed, Whitmore's case moved through the federal system. His lawyer tried to argue that the comments were taken out of context, that the charges were politically motivated. But the evidence was overwhelming. The altered records, the secret payments, the texts where he joked about cleaning up the docket by dismissing cases from certain neighborhoods. He eventually agreed to a plea deal, 5 years in federal prison, no chance of early release, and a lifetime ban from holding public office. When the sentence was read, there was no celebration, just a quiet sense of closure. She didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to. She'd already done what mattered. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the civil rights group. The new courthouse training program starts next month. They're naming the courtroom after Adhering Lucy. She smiled. Adhering Lucy, the first black student to integrate the University of Alabama, who faced mobs and threats just to sit in a classroom. Naming a courtroom after her wasn't just symbolic. It was a promise that the law belongs to everyone, that dignity isn't earned, it's given, that no one should have to prove they deserve to be heard. Her youngest came running out then, holding a drawing. Look, Mom, I made you a judge. She took the paper. In bright crayon, she was standing tall in a black robe, gavel in hand with a big sun shining behind her. At the bottom, he'd written, Fair. She hugged him tight. This is the best courtroom I've ever been in, she whispered. Later that night, she wrote in her journal, not for anyone else to read, just for herself. I didn't set out to change the world, she wrote. I just wanted to keep my job. But maybe that's how change starts. Not with grand speeches, but with ordinary people refusing to accept what's wrong. And as she closed the notebook, she knew one thing for sure. The work wasn't over. There would be more Whitmores in other towns and other systems. But now people knew they weren't alone. They knew their voices mattered. And they knew that sometimes, just sometimes, justice doesn't wait. It arrives right on time. 6 months had passed since that morning in the courtroom, the morning that felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The courthouse still stood on the same corner, same brick facade, same tall columns, but everything inside had changed. Even the air felt different, lighter somehow, like the walls had finally exhaled after holding their breath for years. She walked up the steps not as someone summoned, not as a defendant, but as a guest. Her heels clicked softly against the stone, and she adjusted the lapel of her blazer, a deep green this time, not navy. She wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to speak. Inside, the room once known as Courtroom 3 now bore a small bronze plaque near the entrance. The Authorine Lucy Courtroom, where justice begins with dignity. It had been unveiled just 2 weeks earlier in a quiet ceremony attended by students, elders, and a few judges who'd admitted they'd been wrong to stay silent for so long. Today was different. Today was the first statewide symposium on judicial ethics and community trust, and she was the opening speaker. Not because she was famous, though her story had been in textbooks now, in training videos for new court staff, but because she represented something real, the person the system is supposed to serve. She stood at the podium, looked out at the rows of faces, judges in robes, law students with notebooks, community advocates, even a few former defendants who'd come just to see her speak. No cameras were rolling for broadcast, but a small recorder sat on the table, capturing her words for training archives. "I never wanted to be a symbol," she began, voice calm, steady. "I just wanted to keep my nursing license so I could take care of my kids. But sometimes life puts you in a moment you didn't ask for, and you have to decide, do I walk away or do I stand?" She told them about the fear, the shame, the way she'd replayed the judge's words in her head for nights afterward, wondering if she'd done something to deserve it. She talked about the silence in that courtroom, the way no one spoke up, not even the people paid to protect fairness. But then, she said, something unexpected happened. People started seeing me, not as a case number, not as a problem, but as a person, and that changed everything. She didn't dwell on Whitmore. His name wasn't spoken once. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about what came after. Behind her on the wall hung a new portrait, not of a former judge, but of a group of everyday people, a nurse, a mechanic, a teacher, a teenager holding a stack of books. The caption read, "The people the law serves." After her talk, she stayed to answer questions. A young law student asked, "How do you keep from losing hope when the system feels broken?" She thought for a moment. "You don't fix the whole system in one day," she said. "You fix one moment at a time. You show up. You speak clearly. You treat people like they matter, even when they're scared, even when they're angry. That's how trust grows. Not in speeches, in small choices." Later, she walked through the courthouse halls and saw things she never thought she'd see. A welcome desk staffed by bilingual volunteers, clear signs in plain language explaining court procedures, a quiet room where people could sit before their hearing if they were nervous, and in the clerk's office, a new digital kiosk where anyone could check their case status, upload documents, or file a concern, without having to ask permission. The old records clerk, the one who'd handed her that envelope months ago, now ran the new community liaison program. She smiled when she saw her. "We've had over 300 people use the complaint portal this month," she said. Most just wanted to be heard. And now they are. That afternoon, she visited the new training room where every new judge in the state would now spend a full day listening to real stories from real people. Tenants, small business owners, parents, veterans, before they ever take the bench. One of the first recordings played was hers. Not the viral clip, but a longer version, where she explained what it felt like to be dismissed before she'd even finished speaking. "It's not about guilt," the program director told her. "It's about empathy. You can't serve justice if you don't understand the people standing before you." On her way out, she passed the old courtroom one last time. The bench was empty, but sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust in the air like tiny sparks. She paused in the doorway, remembering how small she'd felt standing there, how invisible. Now, she felt neither. She'd started a non-profit since then, not with big donors or fancy offices, but out of her living room at first, then a shared space downtown. It was called Clear Path Legal Aid, and its mission was simple: help people navigate the system without fear. They offered free workshops, accompanied people to court if they wanted support, and train volunteers to spot when someone was being treated unfairly. Most of the team were people who'd once been on the other side of the bench. People who knew what it felt like to be talked down to, ignored or rushed through. Now they turned that pain into purpose. One of their first success stories was a grandmother fighting an eviction. She'd been too scared to speak in court, convinced she'd lose no matter what. But with a clear path advocate beside her, and a judge who actually listened, she got a fair hearing. She kept her home. That was the real victory, not headlines. Not arrests, but ordinary people walking out of courtrooms feeling like they mattered. As she drove home that evening, the radio played softly. No news, just music. Her kids were at a friend's house, so the house would be quiet for a few hours. She thought about making tea, maybe reading a book that wasn't about law or policy for once. But before she turned onto her street, she slowed the car. There, on the sidewalk near the park, stood a small group of teenagers holding handmade signs. Respect starts here, fairness for everyone. They weren't protesting. They were handing out flyers about their school's new civic club, inspired, they said, by that woman who stood up to the judge. She smiled. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. But she drove a little slower, just to watch them for a moment, full of hope, full of fire, already believing they could make a difference. That night, after dinner and homework and bedtime stories, she sat on the back porch again. The fireflies were out. The air smelled like jasmine from the vine climbing the fence. Her youngest had drawn another picture, this time of her standing in front of a big building with a heart over the door. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, "My mom fixes courts." She tucked it into her journal, right after the entry she'd written months ago. Then she looked up at the stars and whispered, almost to herself, "They tried to silence me. Instead, they gave us a voice." And in that quiet moment, she knew the work would never really be done. There would always be rooms where power went unchecked, voices ignored, dignity denied. But now there were also more people willing to speak up. More systems designed to listen. More children growing up believing that fairness isn't a privilege, it's a promise. She wasn't a hero. She was just a mother who showed up, dressed neatly, spoke clearly, and refused to disappear. And sometimes that's enough to change the world. One courtroom, one heart, one moment at a time.